We had Flaming Rant come. She's a Christian artist.
Okay, I saw that. Yeah.
She didn't get a show anywhere in this side of the state.
I don't know.
They might have been waiting for her to go to Vegas.
Yeah.
Let's see where it goes.
Okay.
As I said, people need it. It's also a huge house. So Sunday morning, even if I get 300 people, preaching to them
Yeah.
on their own.
Yeah.
But the reality is that people see it, they know it's there, they know it's alive. Hi, friends. Good evening. And welcome to the historic sanctuary here at the Fountain Street Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Fountain Street Church is an unaffiliated interreligious community of seekers. My name is Nathan Dannison. I'm the minister here at the church. I want to welcome you to this space that has stood here in the center of the city for over a century and a half as a voice for those with no other place to speak their voices. You are welcome here. If you are part of a movement for community building or justice or the creation of arts and healing, I want to remind you that this space is here for you. This campus is available to you or your organization to have your meetings here, to gather here, to present here, and we do that free of cost or expectation. So please just give us a call and we will find a room for you, a space for you. So our speaker this evening is part of the great tradition of great speakers here at Fountain Street Church. He is an author, a podcaster, an independent candidate for President of the United States of America. He is many things, but most importantly to me anyway, he is a truth teller. And I hope that you will hear his truth tonight. Following this presentation, you'll have an opportunity to leave a donation in either of the offering baskets that are in the back on your way out to contribute to an honorarium or purchase his book, Unsettling Truths, which contains in it even more truth. But at this time, I want us all to give a warm welcome to Mark Charles.
Thank you. Yat E. Mark Charles Yinish, yeah. Tsin Beke Dena Nishle, the Tohiglini Bashis Chin, Tsin Beke Dena Dash Chedo to the Chitni Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Beke Dena Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dena, and my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I want to acknowledge that we are here in Grand Rapids on the lands of the Potawatomi, the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, and the Peoria. These are the nations that they were living here, they were hunting here, they were farming here, they were fishing here, they were raising their families here and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they're still here. So I want to acknowledge these nations as the host peoples of these lands. I want to thank them publicly for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state for my own benefit and for your benefit how humbling it is to be moving, breathing, living, and existing on these lands today. So a shahat to our indigenous relatives, the Potawatomi, the Anishinaabe, the Odawa, and the Peoria. Thank you for your stewardship of these lands. Over the next 60 to 75 minutes, up to an hour and a half, we'll see. I'm going to talk to you, and I wanted to talk to you because I live in Washington, D.C. My Navajo people call it Washington. It's the traditional land of the Piscataway. I've been living there for about a decade. And normally, like what I would tell people is the Washington, D.C. you see on the news and the Washington, D.C. you see when you live there are 2 very different places. The Washington, D.C. you see on the news gives you hypertension, and you can only live there for about 18 months before you either die or pass out or something else. But the Washington, D.C. you live in is much different. Washington, D.C. is majority African American, followed by Latinx, and you're generally sheltered from the chaos that is confined to Capitol Hill and the area around the White House. I didn't even know there was an insurrection going on a few years ago until I got home that evening and turned on the news. I'm like, oh, a mile and a half from my house, there was an insurrection going on. I didn't even know it because I wasn't in that bubble that day. But this past 4 months, the chaos has seeped out. And you can really feel what's going on, not just in DC, but around the world. And it doesn't even really matter who you voted for, whether you voted for Trump or whether you voted for Kamala, right? People are on both sides of the aisle are now getting concerned about the future of their jobs, about their retirement investments, about what's happening with our top secret communications and where are they being shared on which social media platform. I mean, right, there are people on both sides. It doesn't matter who they voted for. They're like, oh, I didn't know my job was going to be threatened, right? I thought it was just the black jobs or the migrant jobs that, those were the ones that were, but it's like, no, this is causing a lot of people on both sides of the aisle to really begin to think about what's going on. The chaos is kind of moving all over the place. And so as that chaos has gotten more and more, and there's been a lot of reaction all over the country, when you live in DC, you can tell who's in power based on who comes for what reasons. So I tell people I was raised as a white evangelical. My grandparents on my father's side, my Navajo grandparents, were boarding school survivors. The gospel that they were given was the gospel that said God loves you when you're white and when you speak English and when you worship in this Western way. My mother's church, the Christian Reformed Church, ran a boarding school on our reservation. And were teaching those things. They were taking students, young Navajo people, from their homes and indoctrinating them in these military-style boarding schools. And so I was getting this from both sides of my family, of this very strict, this very conservative understanding of Christianity and of faith. And so a lot of my experience, even coming here to Grand Rapids, for the past probably 25 years, I bet I've been in Grand Rapids 2 or 3 times a year. I've led mission teams for the CRC. I've lectured at their seminary. I've lectured on their campus. I've served on their board of trustees. I've done numerous things all around the CRC. But I was always in that bubble, right? I would fly in the Grand Rapids Airport. They would pick me up at the airport, and they would drive me to the Prince Conference Center, and I would stay there, and I would eat my meals there, and I would go to the meetings there, and then I would go back in the van to the airport, and I never really got out to the city. I never really got out to see Grand Rapids. I never had any idea a community like this, like Fountain Street Church, existed. My whole image of Grand Rapids was this conservative bubble. And so when I've been slowly getting canceled by my denomination over the past few decades, as I've been talking and being a bit more vocal about both the Christianity that was given to my grandparents and about the direction the denomination's going today. And so every time I come back to Grand Rapids, now I get a little more out of my bubble, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to speak to not only the members of Fountain Street Church, but other people who I've invited, both from the CRC and others who have been able to make it here tonight. And I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have, because tonight I want to talk to you about Christian nationalism. I want to talk to you about creation stories, and I want to talk to you about corn. Now, you may be wondering, what do all of these things have in common? Well, I have been wrestling for a number of years on what does it mean to be a Native American and to be a Christian. How does my culture, my faith, my language, my understanding of the sacred impact and affect the way that I not only worship Creator, but follow this person named Jesus, which is what we were taught. And so as I've been wrestling with this, I've been I've been wrestling a lot with the teachings of the Bible and with the teachings of the church and trying to find out where they reconcile and where they don't reconcile. About 25 years ago, I was actually the pastor of a church in Denver, Colorado. It was called the Christian Indian Center. It was a mission started by the Christian Reformed Church to the Native community in Colorado. And I was beginning to network with indigenous Christians from all over the world. And I was gathering on a regular basis, on an annual basis, with people who were really asking, what does it mean to be indigenous and to be a Christian? What does it mean to understand who we are in the midst of this faith and of this religion that really oppressed so many of our people? And after a few years, I decided if I really wanted to leave in that frame, I had to go back to the Navajo Nation and live among my own people. And so I moved from Denver, Colorado, and I moved back to the Navajo Nation. And for 3 years, my family and I lived in a very remote part of our reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We lived in a one-room hogan, about 25 feet in diameter. Our neighbors were shepherds and rug weavers. We lived on a sheep camp. There was no running water. There was no electricity in that community. And we moved there kind of prepared to live off the grid. But when we got there, so we knew we had to haul our water, we knew we had to use the outhouse, we knew there were going to be cows and sheep wandering outside our doors, and we knew we were going to have to live off the grid. But the hardest part about living there was it felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. We weren't expecting how isolated we were going to be living in that environment. And for the first 2.5 years we lived there, I could count on a single hand the number of non-native or immediate family members who came to visit us on the reservation. On a single hand. At the same time, I was seeing the historical trauma of my Navajo people. The broken families, the addiction, the things that came from the boarding schools and the removal and the history. And at the same time, I was learning about what's called the doctrine of discovery, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And with all of these things, I found myself becoming more and more angry. And I didn't know what to do with my emotions. I tried to talk with my non-native friends about it. And we were talking on the telephone, we were talking via email at times. And whenever I would bring these things up, I could feel the anger kind of rising up in me and the frustration I was feeling. And soon I would have to bite my tongue so I wouldn't start yelling at my friends. So I learned how to temper myself, and I learned how to talk about this in the third person, like I read it in the newspaper. That let me stay engaged in the conversation longer. But the more I was in the conversation, then the more defensive my friends got. Well, it wasn't my family that did those things to your people. It wasn't my church that did those things. And soon they would be wanting to hang up the phone or drop out of the conversation. And I didn't know how to bring that conversation about, where I could be honest about what I was feeling, as well as present the conversation in a way that drew people into the discussion instead of turning them away from it. And that dilemma, that challenge, is something I've been facing for the past 25 years. We moved shortly thereafter. We were in that hogan for 3 years. We moved to another part of the reservation. We lived closer to a paved road. We had running water and electricity, but we were still fairly isolated. We were there for about 8 years, and then 11 to 10 years ago, we moved from the Navajo Nation to Washington, D.C. And I moved there specifically because I wanted to find some way to engage at a national level regarding our nation's history with both national and even global leaders. And I've been in D.C. for 10 years now. And it's a challenge. I can tell who's in power, who's in the Oval Office, based on who comes to town for what reasons. When there's a Democrat in the Oval Office, all of my liberal friends come to town for meetings at the White House, and all my conservative friends come to town to protest. When there's a conservative or Republican in the Oval Office, all of my liberal friends come to town to protest, and all my conservative friends come to town for meetings at the White House. And what I realize is the church, both the left and the right, conservatives and liberals, they're not being prophetic. They're not speaking truth to power. They're either lobbying or protesting. And so much of the history of the church, I think, is or should be about speaking truth to power, no matter who's in power. And that began to be something that I really worked hard at over the past few decades of my life. How do I find a way to speak truth to power? It was said earlier when in the introduction that I ran for president. I was an independent candidate for president in 2020. I ran against both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, which gives me a unique perspective to critique both of them that most people haven't experienced before, because I've actually run against them. And I've run against the Democrats and the Republicans. When I ran for president, the goal of my campaign, my vision for my campaign, was I wanted to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people actually meant all the people. If you read our Declaration of Independence, 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. Making it very clear, the only reason the Founding Fathers used that inclusive term, all men, and they said men, not women, was because they had a very narrow worldview of who was actually human. Joe Biden liked to frequently misquote the Declaration. He liked to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. I don't disagree with the sentiment, but just misquoting it doesn't fix the problem. Right? We have to actually wrestle with the underlying value that that document lays out for the vision and the foundation of this country. The Constitution, which starts with the words, we the people, sounds inclusive. Article 1, Section 2, just a few lines later, the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this document. It never mentions women. And in fact, if you read the entire Constitution, you will find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns, 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 also specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So people get shocked, right? That women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar or have no control over what happens with their bodies. This isn't shocking. The Constitution's working. The document wasn't written to protect women. People get outraged that our prisons are filled with people of color. This isn't shocking. The Constitution wasn't written to protect people of color. If you take away natives, you take away women, you take away African Americans, in 1787, who's left? White men. And technically, you had to be a landowner to vote. People get outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United. Rules that corporations now have the same political rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs. This is how Elon Musk donated $200 million to Donald Trump through a super PAC and got the head of Doge. Right? This isn't shocking. This is what the Constitution is supposed to do. It's protecting the rights of who? White landowning men. It was written so people like Elon Musk could do what he did. That's why we have a Constitution. So I ran in 2020, and the goal of my campaign was, I said, let's build a nation where for the very first time, we the people actually means all the people. Wouldn't that be beautiful? I told people when I was campaigning, I said, if you think our Constitution was written to protect everybody, get in a public group, diverse group, and read the document out loud. You will be shocked at how quickly our Constitution turns racist, turns sexist, and even turns white supremacist. During the campaign, when I was running, there was a horrible tragedy in 2020, which we had a public lynching of a black man in Minneapolis. George Floyd was killed. And I was hoping it would be a moment where the values of my campaign could be discussed more fully. Anyone remember what Donald Trump's reaction to George Floyd, what his solution was to the way he was choked and killed publicly? And remember his solution? He said, perhaps we might maybe want to think about banning one or two types of chokeholds. Anyone remember what Joe Biden's solution was? Anyone remember? He suggested we learn how we train our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. That was his solution. 2.5 months later, Jacob Blake was shot non-lethally in the back 12 times. They got what they wanted. He wasn't choked, and he wasn't shot lethally. Did it fix the problem? Not at all. Not even close. You would think, right? With these two leaders running and proposing these kind of ideas in the midst of this national crisis, people might stop and say, maybe we have the two wrong candidates up in front. Maybe they would have found this guy who was running, who was saying, we need to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people means all the people. We have to address the sexism and the racism and the white supremacy in our founding documents. But nobody even looked at that. Nobody even talked about those things. June 1st of 2020. June 1st of 2020. There's a park right in front of the White House. It's called Lafayette Park. Protests were happening all around the country after what happened to George Floyd. There was protests going on every single day in Lafayette Park. June 1st of 2020, early that morning, law enforcement went out and they aggressively cleared the park. They cleared the park. The park was empty for the first time in weeks, if not months. A few hours later, President Trump walked out of the White House, walked across the park, and stood in front of the church across the street, held up his Bible. It was upside down at first, turned it around, took a photo, said hardly nothing, and then walked back. Remember this? This has been etched in your brain, right? He was immediately called out for exactly what he was doing, which is he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists. That's what he was doing. The Proud Boys, other groups, and everyone who saw him do that knew what he was doing, and he was called out on social media, on the news broadcasts, all over he was called out for exactly what he was doing. Now, during this campaign, Joe Biden was running, and he was promising to be the anti-Trump, right? He was going to bring respectability back to the White House. He promised he was not going to do his foreign policy on Twitter. He said he was going to speak with a more complete sentence structure. Right? He was going to be the anti-Trump. And he won. He got elected. And a few months later, he was tested. Early in 2021, there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan. It's a devastating attack. Many U.S. service members were killed. And Joe Biden had to respond. He had to say something. And so he gave a speech on August 26th of 2021. In his speech, he said, "To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command." Now, over the past 2.5 years, since there's been a war in Gaza, or not, a war in Ukraine, sorry, we'll talk about Gaza later. There's been a war in Ukraine. President Putin of Russia has said something like this very similarly several times. If NATO puts any boots on the ground in Russia, he will use every measure at his command to defend his homeland. And we have been appalled. How dare you talk that way, Mr. President? How dare you talk that way? You are a nuclear power. How dare you threaten nuclear warfare? You are being irresponsible. But our president said the exact same thing in 2021. And if I didn't tell you Joe Biden said that, you all would have thought Donald Trump said, because he spoke the exact same way when he was in office. But Joe Biden didn't end there. He went on and said, "I want to thank the Secretary of Defense and the military leadership at the Pentagon and all the commanders in the field. There has been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission and the best way to achieve those objectives." He went on to say, "Those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah when the Lord says, 'Whom shall I send and who shall go for us?' And the American military has been answering for a very long time, 'Here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me.'" In his first State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. This was a sacred place to be having this speech. He used it again when he talked about our sacred obligation, our sacred duty to take better care of our veterans. Now, I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral responsibility to take better care of those who fight wars on our behalf. But he used the word sacred. Why? Because Joe Biden believes the U.S. military is the army of the Lord responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. We've been told white Christian nationalism was a partisan issue, and Donald Trump was the problem, or at least the Republicans. But that's not true. Joe Biden is every bit the white Christian nationalist that Donald Trump is, if not even worse. Donald Trump just says something to whatever pops into his brain or to make people like him. Joe Biden thinks these things through. And the problem is most of our media leans to the left. Not just CNN and MSNBC, but AP News, NPR, PBS, most of our media news organizations lean to the left. So they're not going to call out this speech. Why? Because it would destroy their advertising demographic. Fox News doesn't have the theological acumen to understand what he's saying, so they're not going to say anything. And so we buy the lie. White Christian nationalism is a partisan issue. And we lay it at the feet of Donald Trump. And I'm not saying it doesn't deserve to be laid there most of the time. But if we think it's a partisan issue, we're living in a news bubble. So where does that leave us? Where does that come from? Why is white Christian nationalism such a bipartisan issue? Why do both the left and the right view our military in this way? In this book, On Selling Truth, the book I co-authored with my good friend Sung-Chun Ra, the two hardest chapters to read in this book are chapters 9 and 10. In chapters 9 and 10, we deal with the adage that says the victors write the history. Now, no one disagrees with that. We all pretty much agree, right? If you win a war, you get to write about the war. In that chapter, the beginning of the chapter, we speculate if Nazi Germany won World War II, how would their historians have written about the legacy of Adolf Hitler? Well, he'd be the greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global security to global dominance, had they won the war. Had they won the war, how would their historians have wrestled with the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war, right? What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. What makes chapters 9 and 10 the most difficult chapters to read in that is we point out that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never been disarmed. We've never had a regime change. We've never given up massive tracts of land. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. Technically, the Korean War's not over yet. We pulled out of Afghanistan, we pulled out of Vietnam, but we didn't lose any land there. We've won every major conflict we've been in since we were founded as a nation. As a result, we, and by we I mean white landowning men, have been able to write their own history for 250 years. So what makes chapters 9 and 10 so challenging is we take that adage of the victors write the history and the understanding that we've never lost a war that matters, and we apply it to this man, Abraham Lincoln. And over the past few decades, as race relations have gotten worse and more tense in our nation, the stock of Abraham Lincoln has only risen. It's a general consensus by most Americans that Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president, the greatest president in our nation's history. When Donald Trump said something in 2016 when he was running that was white supremacist, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, rebuked him. And he said, "We are the party of Lincoln. We believe in the equality of everybody and the value of everybody's life," or something to that effect. When our nation's first black president was sworn into office, President Obama, a Democrat, he had his hand on the Lincoln Bible. Both sides love Lincoln. But because we've never lost a war that matters, we actually don't know who Lincoln is. So I'd like to introduce you to Lincoln in the next few minutes, if I could. I want to introduce you to him the same way he introduced himself when he ran for Senate in 1858. When he ran for Senate in 1858, Abraham Lincoln was largely unknown, but it was known that he was against the institution of chattel slavery. When he ran, he was running against Judge Stephen Douglas. They were in Illinois, in the north. And in that campaign, Abraham Lincoln had a series of debates with Judge Stephen Douglas. Now, the debates they had back then were different than the debates today. It wasn't just sound bites for 10 seconds or 15 seconds. There were 3 speeches. The first person spoke for about 30 minutes. The second person spoke for about 40 minutes. The first person came back and ended with another 10 to 15-minute speech. It was a series of 3 speeches. They prepared for them differently. I think most of the candidates slept the night before the debates. That was a joke. So in that debate, Abraham Lincoln had to introduce himself nationally. And this is what he said. "I will say then that I am not, nor have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And in so much as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, and self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now maybe you're wondering, why would he introduce himself this way? Why start in the North, which were the good guys, right? Why introduce yourself as a white supremacist? Well, remember back to the 2022 midterm elections. There was a Supreme Court case just a few months before that election with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That Supreme Court case framed the debate in the 2022 midterm elections, and everyone, no matter what office you ran for, local or national, you had to take a position on Roe versus Wade. Well, before the 1858 midterm elections, there was another Supreme Court case that framed the debate of that midterm election, and that was the Dred Scott case. And the Dred Scott case ruled that formerly enslaved people, black people, did not get protection from our founding documents. And so everyone who ran the midterm elections had to take their position on Dred Scott. And Abraham Lincoln made it very clear he absolutely agreed with the Dred Scott decision. He had no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes, allowing them to hold office or intermarry. He absolutely believed they were inferior to the superior white people. Now, I could go on. I have a whole chapter on this, but we're not going to because don't have all that time. But I want us to end with his legacy, which was the 13th Amendment. Now, most people think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. They think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. But that's not what it says. What it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted shall exist. You see, we've never abolished slavery in our country. It is 100% legal and constitutionally protected under the jurisdiction of our criminal justice system. We have never abolished slavery. This is why we have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. And this is why we incarcerate black people and people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate we incarcerate white people. Because prison is where enslavement is still legal. Constitutionally protected to this day. Now, we actually know these things about Lincoln. Who's been to the Lincoln Memorial? Raise your hand. Keep your hand up. Who's been to the museum at the base of the memorial? The base of the memorial, there's a small museum about the size of a large classroom. On each wall, there's plaques about 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, marble plaques, different sayings and quotes by Lincoln etched onto them. On one wall are these 5 plaques with quotes from Lincoln about the Union. On that plaque, in the middle of that wall, it says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle," wrote Lincoln, "is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. It's not lamenting that fact. It's not bemoaning that fact. It's celebrating that fact. Look at how much this guy loved our Union, so much that he didn't give a crap about the black lives. And it's hanging there today. You could drive there, fly there tomorrow, and read this plaque. It's hanging there. And unfortunately, this isn't the end of the story with Lincoln. He lost that Senate run. went on to become president. In 1862, he passed two bills, or signed two bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres and was willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act gave the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 2.5 years of signing these bills, in the spring and summer of 1862, in the fall of 1862, we had the Dakota War of 1862, a very bloody, violent war, ended with the hanging of the Dakota 38, the largest mass execution in the history of our country. In response to that war, Abraham Lincoln in 1863 nullified the treaties of all the tribes in Minnesota. Without treaties now and no new negotiations, he ordered the removal of all the native nations from the state of Minnesota. They were put on barges, put onto trains, put onto wagons, marched out, shipped out of the state into the Dakota Territories. On January 29 of 1863, I just want to read this for you. Sagwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, our big river, in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across the half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from the hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The Army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or to freeze. In 1863, later that year in the fall, General Carleton of the Union Army in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, gave an order. He ordered all of the Navajo men, women, and children rounded up. Those who could not be captured or would not be captured were to be killed immediately. Army captains went through our lands. These are the lands of my people. They burned our crops. They destroyed our livestock. They destroyed our homes. They hunted our people throughout the land. 10,000 of our people were rounded up and forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo in southeast New Mexico. Hundreds of them died of exposure and starvation along the way. And 1/4 of my people died while imprisoned in what can only be called a death camp. A death camp that Abraham Lincoln approved on January 15 of 1864. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second of the Pacific Railway Act. This allocated more land and resources to the railway, and it gave the railway companies the mineral rights to the ground to incentivize them financially to work harder. On November 29 of 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho in eastern Colorado were on their treaty grounds. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. A U.S. Army, a Union Army led by a Methodist pastor came over the hill. The men, the soldiers, the warriors were out hunting. It was in the morning. It was women and elders and children in the camp, and he ordered all of them slaughtered. They went through and killed all of them. That evening, the soldiers paraded the genitalia of the natives through the streets of Denver in celebration of this massacre. 8 days later, Abraham Lincoln was giving his annual address. He said 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. After these 4 massacres, the last of which happened 8 days before that speech, Abraham Lincoln was positive the Transcontinental Railway was going to make it all the way across the country. In the midst of that, in the middle of these massacres, in 1863 and in 1864, Abraham Lincoln gave 2 Thanksgiving Day proclamations Prior to Abraham Lincoln, Thanksgiving was celebrated as a regional holiday at different times throughout the fall. He gave 2 Thanksgiving Day proclamations, solidifying them in November. In 1863, he wrote, "Needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlement. The axe," he said, "as well as of iron and coal as of precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield. And the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked these things out. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God." So in the midst of completing all of these massacres and ethnically cleansing native peoples from our lands, Abraham Lincoln paused and said to our nation, let's take a day of thanksgiving and give thanks to God for the land and the blessing and the continuance and the abundance that he is giving to us as a nation. Why would he say that? Why would he view the genocide and ethnic cleansing of native peoples as a gift from God? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to 1630. In 1630, John Winthrop, a Protestant pastor, was on board a ship in what's now called the Boston Harbor, and he was there with a group of people to plant the Boston colony. He preached a sermon on board that ship called A Model of Christian Charity. In that sermon, he referred to the colonists he was with as a city upon a hill. This is borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount when he tells his disciples to be a city on a hill, a lamp on a stand, shining their bright deeds into this dark world. In his sermon, he goes on to exhort his congregants in all meekness and gentleness and patience and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. Just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of a sermon, he does what a lot of pastors do to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations, which is he threatens them from the Old Testament. We're all aware of that, right? And so he says, he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage of the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of Canaan, their promised land. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey, and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. Why would he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the teachings of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel with their promised lands, they were standing on the shores of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Anyone in here read the book of Deuteronomy? How are the people of Israel commanded to take possession of their promised lands? What are they told to do? Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them as the Lord your God has commanded to you. I call this sermon, John Winthrop's sermon, The Model of Christian Charity, the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is not just the belief that Americans are better at things than other people. It's the belief that we have a unique relationship with the God of Abraham or the God of Israel than other people do. This was the 1630s, right? That idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins moving westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. We go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches, a renewal of denominations. Early 1800s, the notion of manifest destiny is coined. The belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule this continent from sea to shining sea. Which is why we were building a transcontinental railway to connect the east and the west coast. There were three major routes. The primary route was at Omaha, Nebraska. It had to go through eastern Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco. There was a northern route that started in Duluth, Minnesota, had to go through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and came out near Seattle, what's now Seattle. And there was a southern route going through northern New Mexico, northern Arizona, and would come out near San Francisco. After the removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, the Bear River Massacre of the Shoshone in northern Utah and southern Idaho, the Long Walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache in the southwest, and the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln had basically just been ethnically cleansing the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway. Which is why 8 days after the Sand Creek Massacre, he was confident we were going to make it all the way across. And he knew it was about the railways because my tribe, my nation's tribe, the Navajo Nation, in the treaty we signed in 1868 to come back to some of our lands in the Southwest, in the treaty that we signed, it stated specifically that we would not oppose the building of railroads through our land. And we knew what we were doing. In 1851, Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, after the California Gold Rush, he was giving his State of the State address. And he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop it. Nor is he saying famine has come and we can't feed these people. He is literally saying we cannot stop killing them until we complete manifest destiny. And this is perfectly in line with Promised Land theology. In Joshua 10, it says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes. Together with all their kings, he left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Christian nationalism is not a partisan problem. If we just don't elect Donald Trump again, we're not going to solve our Christian nationalist problem. It's a bipartisan problem. It's one of the reasons why we celebrate Thanksgiving as a national holiday. I would argue it's one of the primary reasons that we view Lincoln as our greatest president. It's a foundational value rooted in the founding documents of our country and in the church. You see, we have what's called a doctrine of discovery. A series of papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493. They say things like, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find, not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours to take. This is the doctrine that the European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, enslave the people. They didn't see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land here in this new world and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of this book says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your car keys, your laptops out. I will be happy to come by and discover them for you. Right? You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview, and better even yet, your church, tells you the people living there are not fully human. This doctrine, which to this day is used as the legal precedent for land titles. If you own a house, if your church owns property, if your building owns land, if you have a land title and you trace that land title back far enough, it will not go back to a treaty that was signed because all of those treaties have been broken. It will go back to the doctrine of discovery, which the Supreme Court referenced by name as recently in 2005 in one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And you want to know who wrote that opinion? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You see, when your land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. I have a TEDx talk online. It's also written in the book. You can read more about those cases. The TEDx talk is called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in U.S. history. Or it's written in the chapters of this book. We talk about those cases specifically. These are bipartisan values. Christian nationalism is a bipartisan systemic problem that has been moved forward not in spite of the church, but because of it. And we have to find a way to talk about these things. Now I want to talk about creation stories. I have to warn you, this is going to be heavy too. The first one, Christian nationalism, primarily came from the book I wrote on Southern Truth. Creation Stories is coming from the second book I'm writing right now. It's called Decolonizing Faith. It's part 2 to On Southern Truth. Not that it's a continuation of the story, but I'm not repeating myself. I'm building on the understanding that comes from On Southern Truth. People ask me when I co-authored On Southern Truth, why, right? Because On Southern Truth looks at the way the church and the nation misuse the scriptures to justify things like enslavement and genocide and ethnic cleansing and breaking of treaties and stealing of land. And the people ask me, why did you not critique what God said to Israel in Deuteronomy? And I said, because this book is not a critique of Scripture. I'm just telling white landowning men they're not God's chosen people and these are not their promised lands. But as I struggled with it more, I realized I need to address this. I need to find a way to talk about this. A few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, I was at Calvin, the Worship Institute there, at the worship symposium they have every January or February. And a friend of mine was speaking there. He's a friend I've known since I was a pastor of the church back in Denver. He's Aboriginal. He's from Australia. He does incredible work among his people, working on contextualizing worship and understanding the role of the gospel in both the injustice as well as he's just doing a lot of work among that. And he was teaching at this symposium. And I hadn't seen him in a few years. I was excited to hear him speak. And so I flew out just so I could hear him speak. And in his presentation, he gave a great story. I mean, he told the story of his people, the Aboriginal people in Australia, and what happened when Western society and the church came in. And it's not dissimilar from what happened to Native peoples here in the United States. And at the end of his presentation, he did a Q&A, and one of the first questions he got was from a white member of the audience, and they said, his name is Raymond Miniacon. They said, Ray, thank you for the history. That was very, very compelling. I'm curious why you're a Christian if the church has done so many horrible things to your people. Now, I've gotten that question numerous times. Many indigenous peoples, even black people, get those questions a lot, right? The church has done horrible things to people. Why would you follow this faith? We all have our answers that we give. I tell people my grandparents converted in the boarding school. They went on to work for the missionaries. They helped translate both the hymns and even the Bible into our Navajo language. I was curious to hear how Ray was going to answer this question. He said, the reason I'm a Christian is because that's who colonized us. If we were colonized by Hindus, I'd be a Hindu. If we were colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. If we were colonized by Muslims, I'd be Muslim. So I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. I couldn't believe it. He said that out loud. He said, but today, separate from the auspices of the white missionary, he said, I am interrogating my faith to find out if this faith tradition acknowledges my humanity as an Aboriginal man. I spent the weekend with him. I said, Ray, you blew my mind. I said, why did you use the word interrogate? Why not investigate or question or understand? He said, because those words are way too passive. He said, I am putting my faith on trial based on what I did to my people. I am interrogating my faith to find out if this faith tradition can acknowledge my humanity as an Aboriginal man. And I realized that was the journey I was on. And that was the next step I needed to take. And so I started thinking about writing this book called Decolonizing Faith. I'm not writing this book to debate theologians or even pastors. I'm writing this book to reach to the people in the pews, in the chairs, in the seats. And the goal of this book is to cause a crisis of faith in the church. Now, if we were in a CRC church, I would tell them very clearly, so if I cause a crisis of faith in your church, you can applaud me at the end because that was my goal here. You're not in quite the same place as that, so we'll see. Maybe you'll agree. I'm curious. I'm open to I love your feedback after this. I'm writing this book as the grandson of boarding school survivors. It was my grandparents who were taken from their homes, put in a military-style boarding school, punished for speaking their language, punished for practicing their culture. That was the faith that was taught to my father. That was the faith that was taught to me. That was how I grew up in the church. One of the most significant spiritual decisions I made in my life was about 25 years ago. I moved back to the reservation. And I decided to do something that my people have been doing for hundreds, thousands of years, which is to rise every morning and watch the sunrise and greet it with my prayers. Now, when you see the sunrise, whether it's on Easter morning or when you have an early flight, it's always beautiful. And if you pause, it will take your breath away. In fact, the introduction to this book talks about my experience of watching the sunrise. Because when you watch it once, it's beautiful. But when you watch it day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, it does something really deep in your soul. Really powerful. And as I watched the sunrise, and I saw the seasons change, and the birds migrate, and the flowers bloom, and the leaves fall, and the snows come, and the ice melt, and the rains fall, and the droughts, and all. And I saw this going on, and I was a part of it, and I was in the midst of all of this. One of the things that spoke to me about Creator was two things. A, it taught me at a very, very deep level that I am not in control. And that's important because Western culture is all about being in control. You try to control everything, and the things you can't control, you buy insurance for. And this taught me on a daily basis to get comfortable with the fact that I am not in control. I can't make the sun rise quicker. I can't make it go slower. It happens whether I'm there or not. I am not in control. The second thing it did is no matter what I had done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what my family had done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what my nation had done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what the church had done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what the globe had done, no matter what had happened, what bombs had dropped, what people were hurt, what people were killed, what wars were started, what happened, no matter what happened in the past 24 hours, the sun rose every single morning. Every 24 hours, we had another opportunity to take a breath, to say a prayer, and to learn once again how to walk better in beauty in this world that we're a part of. So when I read through the Bible, which starts with a couple creation stories, right? Most people think there's one. There's not one, there's two. And they're not even Jewish creation stories. The Jews took those creation stories from the Mesopotamians, co-opted them. But there's these two creation stories. And white people, white missionaries, are very evangelistic with their creation stories. Which is interesting because white people are some of the most removed from their own creation stories of any group of people on earth. Right? You've long ago left any lands you were indigenous to. You've long forgot your own stories. You've co-opted the stories in the Bible from the Jewish people, which they co-opted from the Mesopotamians, and now you say this is your creation story. And you treat it like a science textbook, not all of you, but right, the society does. No, 7 days, and they have yelling matches and screaming at each other. No, the creation story isn't about how it happened. It's about your relationship with Creator and with the creation. But they're very evangelistic, and so they said to us, your creation story is wrong. You have to give up your creation story. It's pagan, and you have to use our creation story. And so I tried to put myself in the minds of my grandparents when they were young, because they would have grown up watching the sunrise just like I've done for the past 25 years. They have understood things about Creator that I understood in the past 25 years. And I would imagine how they would have read these stories and what they would have said had they been given the opportunity to interrogate this faith that was being thrust upon them, forced upon them. I thought it might make a little sense, right? Creator has two stories of how the heavens and the earth and people are created. They both have different points. After the creation, they're in communion with Creator. Then man and woman sin. And they're punished. That makes sense. There's accountability. But they're not forgotten. Creator makes clothes for them before he sends them out of the garden. Their children likewise disobey. The brothers fight. One brother kills the other. He's punished, but not forgotten. A mark is put on him so he's not killed as he goes out further. These things make sense. It's not like our creation story, but it makes sense. Now, almost every creation story, not all of them, but most people who have a creation story also have a flood narrative. It's a very common theme in creation stories around the world. Our novel creation story has a flood narrative in it. Now, the flood narrative is where the biblical creation story loses me. I have to warn you, this is going to be a little graphic. I'm quoting the Bible, and believe it or not, and despite what you've been told in Sunday school, the Bible's pretty graphic. So, Creator looks out and sees the sin of people and says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. I read that, I'm like, that's not Creator. The sun rises every morning. That's not Creator. Creator decides to save one family, Noah, has them build an ark, puts them in the ark, watches everyone else die. The ark lands. They come out. And Creator gives them a promise. Remember what the promise Creator gave them after the flood?
Never do it again.
Never do what again?
Destroy the world.
No. Never destroy the world with a flood again. Right? That's what the rainbow is a symbol of. I will never destroy the world with a flood. So let's imagine we have a room, okay? And there's children in this room. They're misbehaving. There's no one in charge. They're not obeying the rules of the room. There's fighting. There's destruction happening. Things are being broken. Kids are getting hurt. The parental figure has maybe said to stop or calm down, but they haven't listened to him or to the parental figure. So the parental figure grabs a bat, goes into the room, and just starts wailing on the kids. Kills most of them, leaves a few alive. For those who are left, the parental figure puts a beautiful sign over the door and says to them, this sign is to remind me never to beat you with a bat again. Who's comforted? I'm not, right? That's not the problem is not the bat. The problem is this vengeful, violent behavior of the Creator. Creator later becomes known as the God of Abraham. The God of Abraham's pretty insecure. Decides to test Abraham by telling him to kill his son. Later, the God of Abraham looks down and sees these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. Abraham has a nephew living in these cities. He's like, hold on, God. If I find 50 people, will you save the city? He bargains with God, gets from 50 down to 10. Why does he stop at 10? He knows the size of Lot's family, right? Bargains down to 10. If I find 10, will you say yes? Okay. The angels go into the city. They meet Lot. Lot invites them into their home. The men of the city come to Lot's house, knock on the door and say, hey, we see the men you brought in there. Let them out. We want to have our way with them. Lot says, no, don't do that. That's evil. But here, he said, take my daughters, they're virgins. Lot pimps out his daughters. The next day, Creator decides to destroy the city, sends them out and says, don't look back. Lot's wife, being told to flee, looks back at all she's leaving behind, and she gets immediately judged and turned into a pillar of salt. What's the moral of that story? Don't look back. Who wishes the moral was don't pimp out your daughters? Right? We have a betrayal of God in the Scriptures, and this God is more concerned about a woman who turns around than a man who pimps out his daughters. Is anyone else troubled by this? These are deeply, deeply troubling questions. Later, the God of Abraham becomes known as the God of Israel. Now, instead of being the God of a man, the God of a nation. I have absolutely no problem calling the God of Abraham a he. He absolutely is sexist and misogynistic. The God of Israel decides to save his people by killing the firstborn of every Egyptian family. Take him out to Mount Sinai. He's giving the 10 Commandments to Moses. They're up there a while. While they're up there, the people get impatient. They start worshiping a golden calf. God hands the tablets to Moses and said, here, now depart from me. My people are worshiping another God, and I'm going to destroy them. Moses is like, hold on, God. He doesn't say, you're a creator, and you made these people in your image, and you saved them. He doesn't say that. He says, if you destroy them, the world who saw you bring them out of Egypt with a heavy hand will think it was an evil intent you brought them out here. You are going to look bad, God. He appeals not to God's love for his creation, but to God's ego. And the God of Israel repents and does not bring upon the destruction of his people as he had intended because of his ego. Anyone troubled by that? He saves his people by killing all the Egyptians in the river. Then they get to Canaan. And now God, who's been doing all the killing, again, I'm going to say himself. I have no problem calling God of Israel him. I will not call Creator that, but I will call the God of Abraham and the God of Israel him. And now God says, no, I want you to do the killing. Sends them into Canaan. Kill everything that breathes. In the Psalms, the psalmist, when is in danger, cries out to God and asks God to do what to their enemies? Destroy them. Praises God when God does what to their enemies? Destroys them. In the Psalms, we see violence being defined as love. There's only one group of people that see violence as love. It's those who have been groomed for abuse. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people say to Samuel, we want to be like the nations around us. We want a king. Samuel laments this, goes to God and says, they have rejected me as their prophet. They want a king. And God says to Samuel, no, Samuel, they have not rejected you as their prophet. They have rejected me as their king. God is now referring to himself as king. We start with Creator, move to the God of Abraham, move to the God of Israel, and move to king. We arrive at king. The further the character of God gets from Creator and the closer the character of God gets to king, the more violent, the more vindictive, the more abusive, the more nationalistic, and the more genocidal that God becomes. There's a war going on in Gaza right now. There's 3 participants in this war. There's Hamas, there's Israel, and there's the United States. All 3 of these nations have nationalized their faith traditions. Hamas has nationalized Islam. Israel has nationalized Judaism. And we've nationalized Christianity. All 3 of these faith traditions are Abrahamic religions, and all 3 of these faith traditions accept Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy as scripture. They all have this narrative of God moving from creator to king and becoming increasingly violent, increasingly vindictive, increasingly misogynistic, and increasingly genocidal throughout that narrative. No one's talking about this. And all three of these nations are using the justification of their faith. They're using their faith to justify incredible violence against their enemies. And we're the worst ones. I showed you what Abraham Lincoln did. And we think we're the voice of reason in this. No one's talking about this. In the book Sapiens, the author talks about the evolution of Homo sapiens. And he says that most people get the evolution of sapiens incorrect, and we think there's a chronological order between like Neanderthal man and Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, but they're not chronological. They've actually coexisted. And in the book, he points out that Homo sapiens, us, we're at the middle to the bottom rungs of the food chain. So if a large animal got killed, that animal would eat whatever killed it would eat the major meat off of that animal. Then scavenger would come and would kind of slick the bones clean, and then something would come and would eat more of the stuff around there. Then we would finally come with our opposable thumbs and our finer tools, and we would get the marrow out of the bones. We're the lower rungs of the food chain. We're not very strong, not very fast. If 10 Homo sapiens fought 10 Neanderthals, we would lose. If 50 Homo sapiens fought 50 Homo erectus, we would lose. If 100 Homo sapiens fought 100 Neanderthals, we would lose. About the maximum of people you can organize physically and keep in a cohesive group is about 100. I forget the years, several 100,000 years ago. Homo sapiens developed something that made us unique and shot us to the top of the food chain, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, which is we developed the ability to imagine. An imagination. And imagination gave us the ability to do two things. Well, three things. It enhanced our language, but it also gave us the ability to organize politically and to teach or understand or question God. In our country today, we like to think there's a separation between religion and politics. But it's the same ability that gave us the ability to organize politically that also gave us the ability to understand religion and God, which is our imagination. And if we think that somehow our religion could have developed over these past thousands of years without the one influencing the other, we are kidding ourselves. And the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy demonstrate that perfectly. We need to question our creation stories. I'm not saying we have to give up our faith or give up our beliefs, but if we don't question these things, if we're not allowed to ask these questions, that's what's called a cult, right? It's funny to me that over the past 25 years, the most meaningful way I've learned about Creator is not from reading a book, but from actually being in creation. I was told by the church that the book was the truth about creation, and I couldn't trust what I was seeing and sensing around me And I'm like, that makes no sense whatsoever. If you want to learn about Creator, a book might be helpful, but being in creation makes so much more sense. If you would have told me 10 years ago I'd be writing the book I'm writing right now and asking the questions I'm asking today, I would have said, really, when did I become a heretic? But I'm not a heretic. I would still consider myself to be a Christian. But over these past 25 years, as I become more and more confident in my relationship with Creator, I now have the courage to ask these questions I was told for so many years you're not allowed to ask. And I'm no longer afraid of the answers, because I know who Creator is. And I can read parts of the Bible and I can tell you with the absolute certainty, that's not Creator. That's been influenced by your politics. So we have to find a way to talk about our creation stories. The last thing I want to talk to you about is corn. You won't know this, or most of you won't, but in the last 20 months of my life, I've radically changed my health. I had my hip replaced in June of 2023, and since then, I have every health measure you could possibly have, I've improved. I've lost about 55 pounds. I've lowered my blood glucose level. I've sleep more. I'm in better tune with my circadian rhythm. I'm breathing better. Every possible measure you could have, I've improved in the last 20 months of my life. Anyone ever try to improve their health? Is it easy? No, it's not, right? There's a zillion books out there, and they all overpromise, right? All the authors have their one thing. If you just don't eat this, or move this way, or stand like this, or do this every morning, or if you do breathe this way, or sit in the snow this way, or do something else this way, you will be beautiful, you will be prosperous, and you'll live to be 150. Right? Every author has their one thing. And so as I started reading books, because I was adamant I wanted to improve my health, I also was adamant I didn't want to go on a diet and I didn't want to join a gym, which I thought would make the process harder. But as I started reading these books and trying to figure out what I wanted to do, what I needed to do, I realized with all the books I was reading, every author was overpromising. They weren't all entirely wrong, but none of them were completely correct either. And I needed a filter as I went through these books. And over the past 20 months, increasingly I realized my filter was my indigenous worldview and the teachings of my people. What did we do? How did we move? How did we eat? What did we teach? What was our understanding before we were colonized? And as I went back more and more using that as my filter, I found my way to move through some of these books. One of the first things that I did, I said earlier, I like to watch the sunrise. And for 25 years, on a regular basis, I've gotten up and I've watched the sunrise. But I wasn't doing the tradition completely correct. Because you're supposed to, as a Navajo person, wake up, run to the east, and greet the sunrise with your prayers. And I wasn't running. I was walking outside. I had my reasons why I wasn't doing it, besides the fact that I was lazy. But when I started, I lived in a forest out in the Hogan, and if I ran to the east, I would have run into a forest, and I wouldn't be able to see the sunrise at all. Later, I moved up on a hill, and if I ran to the east, I would be running down the hill away from the sunrise, so I walked up the hill and watched it from there. When I moved to D.C., I was living in a concrete jungle, and no matter where I ran, I couldn't see the sunrise, and so I wasn't running then either. But I decided about a year ago I was going to start running to watch the sunrise. I wasn't going to run to get a better time. I wasn't going to run to train for a race. I was going to run as a spiritual discipline, just like I had been watching the sunrise as a spiritual discipline. And in DC, when you drive, your horn is a part of your body. It's an extension of your vocal cords. So if someone pauses at a red light for more than half a second, you honk at them. If someone even acts like they're going to pull in front of you, you honk at them. If someone even puts their toe into the sidewalk or into the walkway before you and they don't have the green light to go, you honk at them, right? You're not necessarily angry. It's just a way you communicate. But it's also stressful because people are honking and there's a lot of noise going on. And I will admit, I participate in this culture to its fullest. And after I started running, I've been running for about 3 days, and I was driving my daughters to the metro, and someone cut us off and pulled right in front of us. And I didn't honk at them. And my daughter looked at me and she said, "Dad, are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, why?" She said, "That person cut you off and you didn't honk at them." I said, "Yeah, I know, isn't that weird?" I'm completely annoyed, right? I'm upset that they did that, but they're clearly having a bad day. And if I honk at them, I'm just going to make them more angry. I'm actually feeling pretty good this morning, and if I honk, I'm just going to get really tense. It's not that I'm not annoyed by them. I just have greater impulse control. And I immediately felt a tinge of regret that for 25 years I was watching the sunrise and not running. And I was I had regret, but I was also excited, like, what's the next 25 years going to be like as I run with my discipline to watch the sunrise? If you read a bunch of these books, you'll inevitably hear about hunter-gatherer societies. They're like the pinnacle of healthy living. And if you read enough of the books, you'll hear about the Hadza. The Hadza are a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania. They're one of the few hunter-gatherer tribes left in the world. And I'm pretty sure there's a group of scientists just sitting outside their borders waiting for their turn to go in and study them. Because everyone who's written a book on this has studied the Hadza. They've pricked them and taken blood samples. They've had them pee in cups. They've had them analyze their diets. They study them to no end. No one ever interviews them or talks with them or asks them questions. They just study them because they're one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes left in the world. One of the studies that was done on the Hadza, one of the things I did when I started moving is I got my watch. Very helpful. I count my steps. I've increased my steps from about 4,000, which is the average American step count per day, to about 20,000, 15 to 20,000 on a daily basis. And one of the ways I did this is I made my life walkable. So I have an office about a mile from my house. I have a grocery store about a mile from my house. I have my coffee shops about a mile from my house. The metro is about a mile from my house. I walk to my office in the morning. I walk home for lunch. I walk back to the grocery store in the afternoon, walk home after that. That's 4 miles without even thinking about it. I usually do my phone calls while walking. I go for a walk in the evening. I've done 6 to 7 miles without even trying to do anything different. Just part of my daily routine. I go to the grocery store every day. I buy the fruits and vegetables I need for the next 24 hours. What am I going to cook that night? How many apples or oranges or bananas are my kids going to eat? I buy enough for the next 24 hours. Why? So I have to walk back the next day. It makes me continue that process. I've become a hunter and a gatherer. Now the problem is our watches, and right, when you have a watch, not only does it tell you your step count, but also you track usually what you eat. And it's good to track what we eat. We know what's going into our bodies. It's also easy to lie to ourselves. And that wasn't a large, that was a small, right? And you can kind of fib your way through it. But you can get a general sense of how many calories you're intaking. But the problem is your watch lies to you about how many calories you're burning. It lies to you. Literally, it lies to you. Your watch doesn't have a clue how many calories you're burning. The way you measure calorie burn is through what's called a doubly labeled water test. It's like the Cadillac of calorie burn tests. They actually label water, they you drink it, you pee into a cup like a day later, and it measures somehow what happened. And it's the most accurate way to do a calorie count. And so they did they did a doubly labeled water test on some couch potatoes from the Midwest and some Hadza people, right? They're all lining up to test the Hadza people. So they tested them. Anyone want to guess the difference in calorie burn between the Hadza and the Midwestern couch potatoes? Guess. Just give me a guess. 2,000? 10,000. Okay. Any other guesses? Closer. Less than 300. Why? See, the problem is Western science is reductionist. You zero in. If you want to be a doctor, you study biology, then you study human anatomy, then you study the respiratory system, then you study the heart, then you study the left ventricle of the heart, then you study the blood vessel going to it, right? And you zero into this little organ, and you learn everything about it, and that's how you understand the body, is you find out the most about you can about this. You're the expert, you're the specialist in this one little part, the pancreas or whatever else it is, right? Western science is reductionary, and that's not a bad thing, but that's not how health works. Because calories is not just about one thing. It's about how your whole body works together. And whether you believe in creation or evolution, our bodies were either created or they evolved over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and your body is not a machine. It's a living organism that has gotten very, very, very good at keeping all of us alive during incredible periods of food insecurity. And so our body is very, very good at conserving energy. And so on a very basic level, if you wake up and you run for a mile, 2 miles or 3 miles in the morning, or you go for your walk every night, right? Your body gets into the rhythm of that. And then the rest of the day, if you did your running in the morning, you're going to probably take the escalator instead of the stairs. You're going to take the elevator instead of walking. You're going to sit instead of stand, right? You're going to do things to rest throughout the day because you're tired. You did your exercise already. Your body's also going to find other ways to conserve your energy. If nothing else, it's going to slow down your metabolism. So much that when you have a hunter-gatherer walking 20,000 steps a day and a Midwestern couch potato doing 4,000 to 5,000 steps a day, the difference in their calorie burn is about 300 calories. Their watch will tell them it's a lot higher. According to my watch, I said I lost 55 pounds over the last 20 months. According to my watch, you know how many pounds I should have lost? 150. 300 calories is about 1/2 to 3 pounds a month, which is what I've been losing. If you're losing more than 1 to 3 pounds a month, you're doing something that's unsustainable. You're either starving yourself or you're moving way too much in a way that your body can't contain or maintain. And once you stop dieting or stop killing yourself with exercise, your body will go back to the equilibrium, which is why so much of our weight goes up and down, up and down, up and down. If you're losing more than 3 pounds a month, you're doing something most likely that is not sustainable. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not a doctor. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just sharing my experience with you. This is the disclaimer I have to give when I talk about these sorts of things. But this has just been my experience and what I've learned. Again, I would have lost 150 pounds if my watch wasn't lying to me. And I didn't lose 150 pounds. And so, as I'm doing all these things, I'm realizing that, yeah, I need to move back more. The benefit of not joining a gym, but moving more, is I don't give my body enough time to really shut down during the day. I keep moving on an almost an hourly basis. I'm moving all the time. And I've become a hunter and gatherer, right? I've lost 50 pounds, 55 pounds in the last 20 months. I eat an ice cream cone every night. I did a lot of hunting and gathering to find ice cream that wasn't highly processed. I eat ice cream that has 4 ingredients: cream, sugar, milk, and either vanilla or cocoa beans. It took me a lot of hunting and gathering to find that. Had to read a lot of labels, go to a lot of different stores before I finally found it, and I love it. But I've become a hunter and gatherer. I read labels, right? What's a processed food? Anything that's cooked with something that you wouldn't find in a normal kitchen. That's a processed food. So as I started reading these things and learning these things, there was a book on breath that I read, and I thought, why would I read a book on breath, right? If you don't breathe right, wouldn't you just die? But I read a book on breath and realized I've been breathing wrong my entire life. And I radically changed my breathing. Again, the filter of what I take and give from all these books comes from my indigenous people. And the thing I want to talk to you for a few minutes about is corn. Who likes corn? When's the last time you ate corn? 2 days ago, okay? Are you talking about a can of corn? Corn on the cob? Let me define corn for us, okay? Corn is what feeds the steer. This is from the book on The Omnivore's Dilemma. Corn is what feeds the steer that becomes the steak. Corn feeds the chicken and the pig, the turkey and the lamb, the catfish and the tilapia, and increasingly even the salmon. A carnivore by nature that the farm fish farmers are re-engineering to tolerate corn. The eggs are made of corn. The milk, the cheese, and yogurt, which once came from dairy cows grazed on grass, now typically come from Holsteins that spend their working lives indoors tethered to machines eating corn. Head over to the processed food and you'll find more, even more intricate manifestations of corn. A chicken nugget, for example, piles corn upon corn. What chicken it contains consists of corn, yes, of course, but so do most of the nuggets' other constituents, including the modified cornstarch that glues the thing together, the corn flour in the batter that costs it, and the corn oil in which it gets fried. Much less obvious is the leavenings, the lecithin, the mono, dye, and triglycerides, the attractive golden coloring, and even the citric acid that keeps the nugget fresh can all be derived from corn. To wash down your chicken nuggets with virtually any soft drink in the supermarket is you have to have some corn with your corn. Since the 1980s, virtually all sodas and most fruit drinks sold in the supermarket have been sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. After water, corn sweetener is the principal ingredient. Grab a beer for your beverage instead, and you'll be drinking corn in the form of alcohol fermented from glucose refined from corn. Read the ingredients of the label of any processed food, and provided you know the chemical names it travels under, corn is what you will find. For modified or unmodified starch, for glucose syrup, and maltodextrin, for crystalline, fructose, and ascorbic acid, and lectin, and dextrose, lactic acid, and lysine, and maltose, and HFCS, for MSG and polyols, for the caramel color and the xanthan gum. Read corn. Corn is in the coffee whitener and the Cheese Whiz, the frozen yogurt and TV dinner, the canned fruit and ketchup and candies, the soups and snacks and cake mixes, the frosting and gravy and frozen waffles, the syrups and hot sauces, the mayonnaise and mustard, the hot dogs and the bologna, the margarine, the shortening, the salad dressings and the relishes, and even the vitamins. Yes, it's in the Twinkie too. There are some 45,000 items in your average American supermarket, and more than a quarter of them now contain corn. We eat corn more than almost anything else. Corn was first cultivated here in the Americas by Native Americans. Europeans never had corn. When they got here, they saw this corn and they didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't until the 1600s we taught them how to plant corn. Corn was a staple part of most tribes' diets in both the South and North Americas. We call them the three sisters. When you plant corn, you plant your corn. You also plant beans and squash right there in the same plot. Why? The corn provides a trellis for the beans to grow up. The beans provide nitrogen to fertilize the soil better for the corn. And the squash provides a ground covering to keep moisture in the dirt. The three sisters, corn, squash, and beans. You plant them together. We taught Europeans how to plant corn. Europeans didn't see us as human. We were savages. So they never bothered to ask us how to eat corn. For most of our foods, they were eradicating them as a way to kill us off. They moved us from our land so we didn't know how to plant and farm the things. They destroyed our bison that most of us were eating. Corn was one of the things they kept. Why? Because corn can adapt very quickly to almost any environment. You can crossbreed corn and modify it by breeding it together. You can, and it switches in like a generation. You can do so many things with corn, and corn is so useful. You can dry it, you can eat it fresh, you can do so many, the husks you can use. There's so many ways that corn is about. I mean, look at all the things we do with corn. In the early 1900s, there was an epidemic here in the US, also in Italy, an epidemic of phylagria. Phylagria is kind of like scurvy. Scurvy is when you have a vitamin C deficiency. It can cause a lot of painful sores and even kill you. Phylagria is when you have a niacin deficiency. It can also kill you. About 10,000 people are dying a year, especially in the rural South, from phylagria every year. It was primarily coming from eating a corn-based diet. Corn is a very useful food, but it's an incomplete starch. And if you eat primarily corn, you will get phylagria. And if you get phylagria and you don't fix it, you will die. And that's what was happening in the South, about 10,000 people. It was also happening in Italy. In the US, we fixed it overnight. We discovered micronutrients, realized phylagria was caused by a lack of niacin. And we fixed our phylagria problem overnight. You know how we did it? We enriched our flour. We had niacin, we had today we had niacin and riboflavin and other vitamins into our flour. We enriched our flour. 10,000 people were dying a year, but we fixed it for the entire nation. Overnight, from one year to the next, like 90% drop in phylagria cases. Italy fixed it over 10 years. They fixed it by telling their people to bake bread communally, to drink more wine, which is made with yeast, which has niacin in it, and to raise rabbits, which is a cheap meat, which also has niacin. Niacin is found naturally in beans or legumes, in yeast, and in meats. It's also found in corn, but it's in a way in corn that's not accessible to the human body. So the U.S. fixed its phylagria problem by changing food. Italy fixed their phylagria problem by changing the way they eat. We fixed it overnight. They took 10 years. In the 1930s and 40s, the University of Illinois did a study. This is coming from a book I read called The End of Cravings. And they did a study on how do you get a pig to butchering weight the fastest. Because the faster you can get your pig to a butchering weight, the cheaper it's going to cost to raise it, the more you can sell it for, the less it's going to cost you, right? They found that to get a pig to a butchering weight the fastest, you feed it a corn-based diet that's fortified with vitamins. Get there almost twice as fast as eating just off the pasture. So today, as I just read for you, right, almost all of our meat that we eat, that you buy in the supermarket, whether it's cows or pigs or chickens, even salmon, they're training them to eat corn, fortified with vitamins. Today, in the United States, our obesity rate is 40%. In Italy, it's 14%. Why? One of the reasons is because we changed our food. 10,000 people are dying, a small fraction of our population, and we changed it for everybody. You can't buy bread unless you work really, really hard that doesn't have flour enriched with niacin. Niacin is the micronutrient that helps your body convert sucrose and fructose into glucose. Glucose is the blood sugar you use to energize your muscles and even work your brain. It's found in wheat, so it's in whole wheat, and as your body breaks down the wheat, it gets the niacin. But when you make white flour and you take off the chaff of the wheat, you're only left with no niacin in there. And so when you enrich it, now, right, when you have white bread, it turns to glucose right away. Partly because we have the niacin right there. It doesn't have to break through the wheat to get to it. So we have an obesity rate of 40%. And obesity is at the basis of most of our metabolic and many of our chronic health problems. Whether it's diabetes, whether it's, there's so many things that come from the fact that we have an epidemic of obesity in our country. When I started losing weight 20 months ago, I had a BMI over 30. I was technically obese. Now, Native Americans, we were using corn for hundreds, thousands of years before Europeans got here, and we weren't dying of pellagra. Why? Well, there's a process called nixtamalization, which is a way of preparing corn with an acidic substance that makes the niacin in corn accessible to the body. Corn, in evolutionary terms, is one of the most successful organisms in the world. And corn got that successful by throwing its lot in entirely with humans. Corn cannot exist without humans. If you throw a husk of corn onto the ground, it will not grow. The corn kernels will not be able to grow through the husk, and even if they do, they're so tightly packed together that they won't be able to, they'll starve each other out before they can really grow. Corn needs someone with an opposable thumb to rip off the husk and separate the kernels and plant them. And so it threw its lot in with us, and we rewarded it incredibly. It's now grown all over the world, and it's the center of most people's diets, including our own. It's become a commodity. You measure your wealth in your corn. You can store it. You can use it in so many ways. Corn, most of the corn grown in this country today is grown at a loss. It costs more to grow it than they can sell it for, which is why our government subsidizes it, and it pays farmers for the loss that they incur when they grow corn, because corn doesn't sell high enough. They're not actually subsidizing the farmers, they're subsidizing the companies that buy the corn, which turn it into all the things that we eat. So why weren't natives dying of pellagra, even though we've been using corn as the base of our diet for so many years? Well, this process of nixtamalization, where you have to cook the corn in something acidic. So corn was first cultivated in the South Americas, and then it spread up into the North Americas, and now it was pretty much everywhere by the time Europeans got here. In the South, nixtamalization is the basis for the word tamale. Limes are acidic. And when you cook your ground corn with lime, It makes the niacin accessible to the human body. And so in the south of the Americas, they were using lime to prepare their corn, the way they eat. And most of the corn they eat is ground corn in the form of tortillas. And they were using lime to make the niacin accessible to their bodies. My people, we make what's called blue corn mush. It's almost like a cream of wheat made out of blue corn. And one of the ingredients in our blue corn mush, and I've known this all of my life, I just learned why a few months ago. When you make blue corn mush, you use some juniper ash in making it. The juniper ash provides the acidity that you need to get the niacin available to your body. Now, our people didn't understand the science of micronutrients, but we knew that we had to prepare our corn this way so it wouldn't kill us. Also, most native tribes view corn as sacred. It's not something you waste. My people, corn pollen, the pollen you get from the husks of the corn, is sacred. We use it in our prayers. Corn is something sacred to many, many native tribes. Why? Because it's really powerful. And if you don't treat it correctly, it will kill you. The problem is, because white people did not see us as human, they didn't think we had anything to teach them. And so once they learned how to plant the corn, they never bothered to ask us, how do you eat it? And they began eating it wrong. It began killing them. And then to fix the problem, they didn't adjust the way they ate, they adjusted the food, which is now causing an epidemic of obesity in the society. The reason we breathe wrong. George Catlin, who was a contemporary of Lewis and Clark, traveled throughout the West for a longer period than Lewis and Clark did. Didn't go to subjugate people or to discover people. He went there to get to know the tribes. Gave us some of the best pictures today we have of native life before colonization. As he traveled and met with hundreds of tribes in both North and South America, the thing he observed over and over and over again is that we were strong, we were tall, we were healthy, and we had perfectly straight teeth. And all of us were adamant about breathing through our noses. He described there were even tribes that the mothers would stand over their children at birth as they went to sleep at night, and whenever they opened their mouths, they would close them to teach them to breathe through their nose. They said there were some tribes that had boards that they would put their babies on to sleep. And they would put a blanket or something behind their head to hold it a little bit forward, so when they slept, they couldn't open their mouth. My Navajo people, we use cradle boards. I never knew why. The reason most Western people breathe through their nose, the book Breath by James Nestor went all the way back to the ossuaries in Paris to study when nasal breathing dropped and mouth breathing began to get more prevalent. It happened as the West began to process its food more. When you eat processed food, you don't have to chew it as much. When you stop chewing, your jaw stops growing. Your mouth gets smaller, your nasal passage gets smaller, your sinuses get smaller, and eventually you start breathing through your mouth instead of your nose. Pre-colonization, we were eating whole foods, not processed foods. Eating whole meats, vegetables, crunchy things you had to chew a lot. When they destroyed our people, marched my people down the Bush Ground, they gave us processed foods, flour, other things like that. Our diets changed overnight. All of these things, you just go through all these things, and there's so many things that we've done as people. When you get home tonight, Google the word nature. Nature is defined as the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. Western society defines nature as something separate from humans. You want to know why we don't know how to take care of the environment? Because we don't see ourselves as part of the natural world. This is why the United States thought it could change food. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote an incredible book called Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a botanist. And in her book, she talks about how she grew up understanding that you could communicate with the natural world. And she went into botany classes, and her professors mocked her because she would talk about talking to the trees and the plants and the animals. And they said, "You have a primitive worldview. That's not the way science works." Well, science today has proven that trees communicate with each other. They use their root systems in the air to communicate when there's a threat or a danger. Something's harming them, to warn the other trees. She said, scientific data is just now beginning to catch up with indigenous wisdom. In 1930, anthropologist Ernest Houghton said, "Since we have known for a very long time that savages have excellent teeth and civilized men have terrible teeth, it seems to me that we have been extraordinarily stupid in concentrating all of our attention upon the task of finding out why our teeth are so poor without ever bothering to learn why the savage's teeth are so good." There's an author named Katie Bowman. She's a biomechanist. When I read her books, Movement Matters and Move Your DNA, it changed my worldview. I took a week off of work just to read her books and understand it. She talks about the okra. When kept in captivity, it tends to have a dorsal fin that falls over. They studied it and found there was a genetic disposition to it. But the reason it falls over is because when an orca is in captivity, it swims in a shallow level in a slow pace around the pool in circles over and over and over again. There's no muscle in the dorsal fin. What holds it straight is the pressure from the diving and the swimming and the hunting and the speed and everything else. So when it just swims like this, the fin tends to fall over. That's a sign it's just in captivity. She said, in old age, we tend to think of old age as people have hunchbacks and their arms are forward, and this is what old age looks like. She said, this isn't old age. She said, since the age of 5, we've been sitting in chairs with our arms in front of us on the table. And then in high school, and then in college, we eat our meals this way, we watch TV this way, we drive our cars this way. We work in the office today, we're at the computer this way. She said, this isn't the sign of old age. This is what comes from 50 years of training, 14 hours a day, to sit in a chair with your arms in front of you. And we think we're going to fix it by exercising for 30 minutes a day. She said, not that exercise is bad, but you're not going to fix 16 hours of this with 30 minutes of doing the same movement over and over and over again. She said, we have to not just be sedentary less, we have to move more. She wrote this. She says, I would suggest that a group of humans has never been this sedentary and survived. We have no idea how to move, and so we are turning to science to show us. P.S., that's not science's role at all, but when you have an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere, and scientific data is where most of us are turning. When you have an elder-free society, when you have a belief that you discovered lands that were already inhabited, and the people who are living here were not human. And so you never bothered to ask them, how do you live well within this land? You need to learn from something, And so most people are turning to the reductionism of science to answer those questions, but science won't teach you that because science is reductionary, and to move and be healthy, you have to be holistic. I'm not saying science is bad, but it will not answer the questions of how to be healthier. If you want to be healthier, you have to incorporate indigenous wisdom. The title of my third book that I'm working on is called Decolonizing Health. When I travel around speaking on this content, I have to teach Western people how to be healthy. I have to remind Native peoples, because we know how to be healthy. We just have forgotten. We've stopped doing it because we've been colonized. But we still have the stories. We still have the teaching. If you want to begin the process of decolonizing your health, it means you have to begin reversing the understanding that natives have nothing to teach you. That you are guests in someone else's house. When I was in the Hogan, and I was trying to figure out how do I talk about this history and talk about what's happened in a way that invites people into the conversation. I wrote a metaphor. I wrote this metaphor. I said, being Native American and living in the United States, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. They've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, "Thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house." Now, you might be saying, Mr. Charles, that's very simplistic. What's a thank you going to do? A thank you, while it's simple, requires you to change your worldview. It requires you to acknowledge this isn't your house. It requires you to acknowledge there are people here before you. It requires you to acknowledge the humanity of Native peoples. And to begin, for the very first time, to build a relationship with us. The church likes to use terms like racial reconciliation. That's a misnomer. It's not accurate. Reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. Race is a human construct. Your doctrine of discovery doesn't acknowledge our humanity. Racial reconciliation is a misnomer. We need racial conciliation. We have to mediate the dispute for the very first time. We have to build this relationship for the very first time. George Erasmus, an indigenous elder from what's now called Canada, he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. And he used this quote. He said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community," he said, "you have to start by creating common memory." I love this quote because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. We have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of internment camps, of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders. There's no common memory, and there's no point in U.S. history where we have had healthy community across racial lines. That point does not exist. We have to do that for the very first time. So while the Democrats are screaming and protesting, and the Republicans are lobbying and worrying, and everybody is feeling anxiety about the chaos that we are in at this very moment, I've decided I want to travel around the country and talk to people about Christian nationalism, creation stories, and corn in an effort to build a more accurate common memory. Not to shame people, not to cancel people, but to build a healthy national community for the very first time. Thank you for letting me talk to you tonight. Thank you. I always do this. I go a little late, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. If you have to go, I completely understand too. I'll let Pastor Nathan decide what we want to do here. I went much longer than I thought.
No, that's okay. I think this is incredibly important, especially given everything that's happening today. I just want to take a minute and remind everybody to do two things. To please, if you haven't already, make a donation to support Mark Charles on your way out through those offering plates that are there, or purchase a book as you go. And if you want to continue getting involved in these conversations, the Great Speaker Series is an ongoing effort, not only of Fountain Street Church, but of the larger community. If you visit fountainstreet.org, you can sign up for the chimes and learn more about these events. And I think, Mr. Charles, if you'll stay for a while, I think that probably there will be some people who have some important questions.
I'll be in the back by the books. If you want to get this QR code, I have a lot of resources on my website, and you can get those resources from this QR code. Also, by my books in the back, I have a bookmark that has the same QR code on it that you can get from there. I am literally traveling the country right now doing these talks. And if you want to support that, you can make a donation tonight, or I have a GoFundMe up on my website that you can follow my journey as I take this conversation around the country. And